They say SEAL training breaks the weak. That's a lie. It's not the ocean that breaks you. It's the men who decide you don't belong. For me, it wasn't a failed drill. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't fear. It started with a hand on my waist that didn't belong there. He cornered me behind the barracks. Whiskey breath, arrogance dripping from his smile. And whispered, "Say yes, or watch your future drown." I told him, "Move your hand, or I break it." He moved. But he didn't forget. And the next morning, for men I trained beside, for men who wore the same uniform, turned BUD/S into a hunting ground. My ruck was overloaded. My compass was rigged. My gear was sabotaged. And during drum-proofing, someone cut my bindings so I'd sink like a stone. They didn't just want me to fail. They wanted me gone. And when I was hauled out of that pool coughing blood and salt water, they signed the report that murdered my career. Failed. Unfit. Dismissed. I didn't fail SEAL training. I was executed by cowards. And 10 years later, those same cowards invited me to the SEAL reunion to laugh at me all over again. They thought I'd walk in through the front gates, head down, embarrassed, broken. But failures walk. I wasn't walking. I was descending. Inside an Apache so loud it shook their glass, their pride, and their lies. And when the dust settled and they saw who stepped out, they finally understood. I wasn't the girl they destroyed. I was the weapon they created. Some wounds come from bullets. Mine came from men who couldn't handle rejection. I never thought I'd see that base again. Not the airstrip. Not the hangar. Not the flagpole still standing at the exact angle I used to stare at during punishment runs. But as my Apache cut through the coastline wind, there it was. Naval Base Coronado, glowing like a memory I tried to bury and failed. The reunion was already in full swing. From 1,000 feet up, I could see everything. Polished trucks lined in arrogant symmetry. Dress blues catching sunset gold. Groups of SEALs laughing with the kind of careless confidence only men who think they're untouchable can carry. And then I saw them. The four. Thorne, Briggs, Hayes, Dalton. The architects of my downfall. They stood together near the hangar entrance. Drinks in hand, shoulders relaxed, power dripping from their posture. Untouched by guilt. Untouched by accountability. Untouched by the life they stole from me. Hayes threw his head back in laughter. Briggs clapped someone on the shoulder. Dalton pointed at the guest list on his tablet, amused. Thorne leaned on a rail like he owned the entire base. Even from the sky, I could read their faces. These were not men waiting to honor their past. These were men waiting for entertainment. Waiting for me. Waiting to see the failed cadet walk through their doors so they could smirk, whisper, and remind everyone how they ended me. They thought the universe still bent for them. They thought the rules of gravity, justice, and consequences didn't apply. I tightened my grip on the cyclic. Not out of anger. Not out of fear. But because I realized something that almost made me laugh inside the cockpit. 10 years later, they were still the same boys. And I was no longer the girl they tried to drown. The pilot beside me glanced at me for confirmation. Approach vector locked, Commander. You want to give them a show? I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Bring us in low, I said. Let them feel it. The Apache dipped. Sunlight slammed across the hangar windows. Dust lifted from the tarmac. Service members turned their heads, narrowing their eyes at the incoming silhouette. Nobody knew yet. Nobody understood what was descending upon them. But for the first time in a decade, I did. I wasn't coming back to be seen. I was coming back to be felt. There's a difference. One demands attention. The other demands reckoning. As we dropped altitude, the base grew sharper. The flags, the concrete, the rows of medals on chests. But none of it mattered. Not compared to the 4 men whose lives weren't ready for the truth flying straight toward them. This is why the story matters. Because betrayal doesn't disappear. It waits. And today, it heard the sound of rotor blades returning home. From the cockpit, looking down at the glow of that hangar, the memories hit me with the same cold precision as a sniper round. People think trauma fades. It doesn't. It waits. It listens. It returns on command, triggered by the exact things that broke you. For me, it was those lights. Those same warm hangar lights that pretended to welcome warriors, but swallowed me whole when 4 men decided I didn't deserve the uniform. The memory begins like a knife sliding between ribs, silent, sharp, unforgiving. I can still hear the gravel crunching behind the barracks. Hayes' boots. Slow. Deliberate. Predatory. I had just finished a 12-mile ruck. I was exhausted, sweating through my shirt, thinking only of sleep. Then I felt it. A hand on my waist. Uninvited. Unwelcome. Unmistakable. I turned and saw the smirk he wore. The kind men use when they believe the world belongs to them. I could help you, he whispered. Make training easier. His breath smelled like cheap whiskey he thought instructors wouldn't detect. It's simple, just say yes. I stared at him. 1 second. 3 seconds. Long enough for him to understand exactly who he was dealing with. Move your hand, I said. Or I break it. His smile disappeared. But the threat didn't. They didn't confront me the next day. Cowards rarely do. Instead, they gathered like vultures behind the dive locker. I saw them. For silhouettes. Heads bent. Hands gesturing. Plans forming. Thorn, the one who hid behind rank. Briggs, the instructor-in-waiting who loved punishment drills a little too much. Dalton, who worshipped Hayes like a god. And Hayes, the architect. I knew I was the topic. Because every time I passed, the whispering stopped. The smirk sharpened. Their eyes followed me like they were already measuring the coffin. The first blow came during navigation training. My compass needle drifted 20 degrees left. Not broken. Tampered with. I ended up miles off course. A mistake a cadet like me would never make on her worst day. But it didn't matter. Failure is failure on paper. And they controlled the paper. Next came the weighted ruck march. I lifted mine and almost collapsed. Someone had added 20 pounds. Wet sand. Packed tight. Enough to shred my joints over 12 miles. Enough to make me miss the time cut off by seconds. Thorn had timed me personally. I still remember the way he shook his head, pretending to be disappointed. But the killing blow, the one that ended everything, came during drum proofing. Hands tied. Feet bound. Water cold enough to shut down breath on impact. I had trained for this. I could do it in my sleep. But when I kicked, the rope slipped. Not by accident. Not by fray. By cut. I sank. Chest burning. Vision narrowing. I fought. I fought like my lungs were filled with razor blades. But the rope loosened again. Because someone had sliced clean through the fibers. And when they dragged me out, limp and choking, I heard them. Laughing. Laughing while I coughed up salt water and blood. I still remember sitting in the office, dripping wet, while the captain flipped through the incident sheet. For signatures. For statements. All matching. All lies. Cadet suffered panic-induced loss of control. Panic. They reduced my courage to panic. My fight to incompetence. My strength to weakness. And just like that, my career died on a wooden desk under a fluorescent light that buzzed like a mosquito. Through the canopy glass, the entire scene unfolded like a crime I was watching from above. Not one of urgency. One of arrogance. Men who once wore the same uniform as me now stood beneath soft hangar lights, untouched by the truth of what they'd done. Thorn lifted a glass, expensive bourbon, from the color. Briggs leaned in to whisper something, no doubt another punchline at my expense. Hayes slapped Dalton on the back, barking with laughter so loud I could see it shake his shoulders even from the sky. It didn't matter how many medals sat on their chests now. It didn't matter what ranks they'd climbed or what stories they bragged about tonight. All of it rested on top of the quiet grave they dug for me 10 years ago. And I could feel something inside me sharpen. Not rage. Not revenge. Something colder. Something steadier. Something I didn't have when they broke me. Clarity. 10 years teaches a woman a lot. How to endure pain without flinching. How to fly through missile lock without blinking. How to bury fear so deep it becomes instinct. How to rise through ranks built to keep you out. But the most important lesson? A broken woman who climbs out of the grave you built for her is not the same woman you buried. They didn't know that. Not yet. My co-pilot flicked a switch, adjusting the engine pitch. The low growl of the Apache deepened. "Commander," he said, "your call. We can come in clean. Or we can come in loud." I watched the four of them. Their drinks. Their smiles. Their comfort. The same comfort that allowed them to ruin a life and sleep peacefully afterward. "Loud," I said. He smirked like he'd been waiting for that answer all night. "Copy that." The Apache banked left. Hard. Wind slapped against the fuselage. Rotors sliced the dusk. The base below shifted from calm celebration to curious tension as people started looking up, shading their eyes, stepping outside the hangar, frowning at the silhouette growing larger by the second. But inside the aircraft, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes a storm. A storm with intent. A storm with memory. I leaned forward, eyes steady on the landing zone. They thought I'd walk in through their doors wearing the shame they put on me. But shame doesn't belong to the one who survived. It belongs to the ones who tried to kill her and failed. The first vibration hit the hangar windows as we dropped altitude. I could see it ripple across the glass panels. A tremor they mistook for thunder. Hayes glanced upward, confused. Dalton stepped back from the bar. Briggs squinted at the sky, adjusting his stance like a man recognizing a threat. Thorne straightened his uniform out of reflex. That was the moment, the exact second, they felt it. A presence returning for them. Not for revenge. For reckoning. My hands steadied on the controls, calm and deliberate, every movement precise as breath. Final approach, my co-pilot called. Below me, the celebration had stopped. The music muted. The laughter froze. Men who once mocked me now shielded their eyes from the blinding landing lights. And in that moment, with the rotors screaming, the tarmac trembling, and the base looking up in stunned disbelief, I understood something crystal clear. They were ready for a victim, but they were not ready for a survivor. They were not ready for the sky to open and deliver the one woman they thought they'd buried. They were not ready for me. They heard me before they saw me. That's the thing about an Apache. You don't see it first. You feel it. The rotors don't just cut air. They cut silence. Thump, thump, thump. The rhythm of a war machine approaching its target. The hangar windows trembled violently. Glassware vibrated. The American flag inside the hangar snapped against its pole like it recognized the sound before the men did. Even from the cockpit, I could see the shift. Postures stiffened. Shoulders rose. Hands drifted toward holsters, not to draw, but to hold on to something familiar as the ground beneath them started questioning their certainty. Men who once laughed at my pain reached for a weapon out of instinct. The perfect irony. The lights flickered once, twice. Then steadied under the pressure of the engine roar. A fine mist of dust lifted across the tarmac, swirling in ghost-like circles, turning the sunset into a battlefield haze. The wind from my descent rolled across the base like a wave, lifting napkins, flipping plastic cups, sending hats tumbling across polished concrete. Then, a silence fell thick enough to suffocate sound. Not true silence. The kind of silence men make when something bigger than them arrives. From my perch behind the cyclic, I watched their world halt in real time. Someone at the hangar mouth took a step back. Another tilted his head upward, squinting into the blinding landing lights. A row of officers froze mid-conversation, hands half raised in greeting that never finished. And then it happened. The moment that stitched itself into memory. Hayes' drink slipped from his fingers. The glass hit the ground. Shattered. Bourbon splashed across his boots. He didn't even look down. That's when I knew. They didn't just hear the Apache. They recognized it. On some deep, primal level. Their bodies understood what their minds refused to accept. The thing descending toward them was not an aircraft. It was judgment. My co-pilot glanced at me. Commander, their whole lineup just froze. I know, I said. My voice came out low, level, steady. The kind of calm forged under tracer fire and missile lock. I pressed the calm switch. Taking her down, I said. Center field. Make them feel every inch of it. He nodded. There was no need for more. The base layout came into perfect view. Hangar, runway, equipment lines. And directly beneath us, a cluster of uniforms craning their necks, waiting to understand what kind of storm was arriving. As we descended, rotor wash slammed into the hangar doors hard enough to rattle the metal frames. Paper rosters flew off tables. Decorations swayed on their hooks. Someone grabbed the edge of a podium to steady themselves. Thorne finally stepped forward, hands raised to block the glare. The first to truly look into the lights. Briggs moved beside him, expression tightening with suspicion. His jaw clenched, his posture adjusted. He knew something wasn't right. Dalton shielded his eyes, shifting uneasily, like a man who suddenly remembered a debt he hoped time erased. And Hayes, the architect, stood motionless, not blinking, not breathing. That alone fueled me more than air. Even through the cockpit glass, I saw the exact moment their confidence shifted into dread. They weren't imagining a stranger. They weren't imagining a VIP. They weren't imagining command. No, they were imagining the one person they prayed they'd never face again. The wind kicked up harder as we descended into final approach. The tarmac blurred under the force of the downdraft. Dust exploded outward in a circular shockwave, washing over rows of stunned faces. My voice stayed quiet, controlled. 10 years, I whispered to myself. 10 years, and this is the first time you've looked up. The wheels touched down. The Apache groaned as metal met earth. Rotors roared. Lights blazed. Dust swallowed the lower half of the aircraft like smoke off a burning battlefield. And in that moment, with the machine vibrating beneath me, with the base paralyzed around me, with 4 men staring into the belly of a war machine they never expected to see, I felt something settle inside me. Not revenge. Not satisfaction. Definition. This was the moment that rewrote the memory. The moment my silence ended. The moment their certainty died. The moment they realized the failure they buried had just landed on their doorstep. In an Apache. The moment the rotors began to slow, the dust finally settled into a low, swirling haze around the aircraft, thin enough to see through, thick enough to distort reality. It felt deliberate, like the earth itself wanted to give me an entrance. I unbuckled my harness and pushed the cockpit door open. Heat rushed in. The world outside was vibrating. Not from the engines, but from the silence of men who had run out of excuses. Boots hit metal, then concrete. My first step onto that tarmac in 10 years didn't feel like a return. It felt like a correction. Helmet under my arm. Flight suit hugging every scar I earned the hard way. Rank glinting in the last light of evening. And my call sign stitched in black and silver. Resting over my heart like a promise I had made to myself long before this night. Raven. I didn't hurry. Warriors don't rush into places that once rejected them. We enter like the ground owes us respect. My crew stepped up behind me. 3 men, 1 woman. Operators whose silence spoke more than any salute. They didn't stand like subordinates. They stood like shadows. Like witnesses. Like people who knew exactly what this moment meant. The youngest of them took 1 step forward, boots snapping against the concrete, spine straight as a rail. "Aircraft secured, ma'am." His voice hit the air clean, sharp, official. But the real impact wasn't the salute. It was the sound the four men made without making a sound at all. They broke on the inside. I saw it clearly. The twitch in Briggs' jaw. The way Dalton stopped breathing. The fraction of a second Hayes' hand trembled at his side. And Thorne's face tightening into the expression of a man who suddenly realized he no longer controlled the battlefield. 10 years ago, they stood over me like executioners. Tonight, they watched me stand over them like a commander. I took another step forward. That was all it took. The crowd parted instinctively. Officers, chiefs, petty officers, civilians. They moved aside as if my presence pushed oxygen out of their lungs. Not fear. Recognition. The kind that comes when a warrior walks past carrying the weight of missions others only read about. But my eyes never left the four who mattered. Thorne's posture stiffened. Briggs tried to adjust his uniform, pretending it was instinct, not panic. Dalton stepped back without realizing he had moved. And Hayes. Hayes's face hollowed in a way that only guilt can carve into a man's bones. It struck me then. They weren't looking at a pilot. They weren't looking at a commander. They were looking at the ghost of the woman they tried to bury, who had somehow learned how to fly. I paused just long enough to feel the air shift around me. The tarmac smelled of jet fuel, steel, and the faint perfume of fear, not mine, but theirs. My heartbeat stayed calm, steady, controlled. 10 years ago, I walked away from this base with failure stamped on my record. Tonight, failure stood in front of me, in 4 different uniforms. And every single one of them knew it. So I kept walking, helmet in one hand, history in the other. I didn't come back looking for an apology. I didn't come back to reopen old wounds. I came back to make sure the truth finally had a face. And that face was mine. I walked straight toward them, boots hitting the concrete like judgment. Slow, steady, unhurried. Each step felt like a verdict being read aloud. Not one person blocked my path. Not one person dared to move in front of me. They didn't part because they were afraid. Fear makes men stumble back. No. They parted because they recognized something deeper. Something older than rank. Older than protocol. Command presence. A real commander doesn't need to speak to be obeyed. Power is silent. Power is atmospheric. Power is the space people give you without being told. I felt the air shift as I walked. Shoulders straightened. Spine snapped into alignment. Hands unconsciously found the seams of trousers. Men who had never saluted me acted like their bodies remembered something their minds had yet to process. And then, the whispers began. Not about me. About the 4 men who had stopped smiling. Is that her? From the incident report? The one they said cracked under pressure? No way, look at her insignia. Is she a commander? That's an Apache crew behind her. Jesus. I didn't acknowledge any of it. My eyes stayed locked on the 4 men who taught me what betrayal really looked like. 10 years collapsed into a single moment. Not in weakness, but in clarity. I remembered every insult, every tampered gear check, every falsified signature, every laugh they shared while I coughed up water on the pool deck. And now here we were. Same ground, different altitudes. I walked until the sound of my boots was the only thing they could hear. Until even the music from the speakers seemed to fade out of respect. Hayes, the architect, was the first to fully register what was happening. His face drained of color, eyes widening as they scanned my rank, my patches, my posture. He looked like a man watching a ghost materialize. Dalton tried to hide his panic, tried to force his expression into neutrality. Failed miserably. Briggs swallowed hard, his jaw twitching with the memory of the lie he signed. And Thorne, Lieutenant Commander Thorne, straightened his shoulders like a man confronting his own reflection in a cracked mirror. As I approached, I passed the last row of officers. One older Master Chief stepped back and murmured under his breath, Goddamn. She's back. I didn't stop. I didn't blink. Each step was a sentence. Each breath was a reminder. Each heartbeat was a reclaiming of ground I should have never been forced to surrender. And something inside me shifted. Not the trauma. Not the anger. Authority. I wasn't a cadet walking into judgment. I wasn't a victim walking into a trap. I was a commander walking into truth. By the time I reached the edge of the hangar's polished floor, the crowd had formed a natural corridor around me. A ceremonial aisle lined with the very people who once called me unfit. I walked straight down that path without hesitation. My boots echoed through the open space, a sound sharp enough to cut through bone. Thorne's breath hitched. Briggs lowered his gaze. Dalton shifted his stance. Hayes clenched his jaw. And in that moment, I understood something I had never allowed myself to believe. They weren't my enemies anymore. They were my witnesses. Witnesses to the rise they never saw coming. Witnesses to the strength they never expected to face again. Witnesses to the woman they built from the ashes of their cruelty. I stopped 3 feet in front of them. Close enough for them to smell the jet fuel still lingering on my flight suit. Close enough for them to see the glint of my wings. Close enough for them to understand that the woman standing before them wasn't here to revisit the past. I was here to rewrite it. The hangar fell into a silence so heavy it pressed against my skin. My crew stood behind me. The Apache loomed like a shadow of war waiting for its next command. And the 4 men who once decided my fate now stood frozen. Not because of who I used to be, but because of who I had become. I let the silence stretch, long enough for their hearts to race, long enough for sweat to gather at their temples, long enough for the truth to sink into their bones. Then, still in pure quiet, I lifted my chin, ready for the moment they would finally break. Admiral Knox's salute hung in the air like a court sentence. Not rushed. Not polite. Formal. Deliberate. The kind of salute you give only to someone whose name will outlive yours. And then his voice carried through the hangar. Steady, booming, authoritative. The kind of voice that has sent men into battle and brought them home. This woman rescued 6 SEALs under heavy fire in Syria. She flew through missile lock for hours. She is one of the best pilots the United States Navy has ever produced. The hangar froze. Not figuratively. Literally. The kind of silence that sucks all the air out of a room. The kind of silence that splits a man open from the inside. The kind of silence that forces the truth into every corner where lies once lived comfortably. But I didn't look at the crowd. I looked only at them. The 4 men who built their careers on my grave. The 4 men who laughed when I drowned. The 4 men who thought their signatures were the final nail in my coffin. Thorne's face cracked first. A small, involuntary twitch at the corner of his mouth. The kind of movement a man makes when the ground under his feet suddenly shifts and he doesn't know how to stabilize. Briggs swallowed hard. His Adam's apple pushing against a throat that had gone tight with fear he couldn't hide. Dalton blinked too fast. As though his brain couldn't reconcile the sight before him with the version of me he buried 10 years ago. But Hayes was the one I watched the closest. Because he didn't twitch. He didn't blink. He didn't swallow. He just stared. Eyes sharp, wide, disbelieving. The look of a man watching the consequences of his own actions walk toward him in full military dress. I could see the exact moment each one of them realized their version of the story, the lie they agreed upon, the lie they repeated for years, was disintegrating in front of an entire room of warriors. Admiral Knox wasn't finished. He shifted his stance, squared his shoulders, and raised his voice another fraction. This officer has flown more rescue sorties under enemy fire than any pilot in her class. And she stands here tonight not because she was carried by luck, but because she earned every inch of her legacy. Another silence. But this one was different. This one was reverence. Respect. Wait. I didn't bow my head. I didn't shift my gaze. I didn't let my breath tremble. I stood still, unbothered, grounded, present. Because 10 years ago, these men stood over me with power. Tonight, they watched me stand over them with truth. People in the hangar began whispering. Low, stunned murmurs that rippled through the crowd like a tide. Wait, she flew the Syria extraction? That was her? The Raven mission. She's the pilot from the Trident Ridge evac. Holy hell. She's a commander? They lied. Someone lied. Why didn't anyone tell us it was her? But I didn't respond to any of it. My entire world had narrowed to 4 men and a truth they never expected to face. Admiral Knox stepped closer and lowered his voice, but not enough for them to miss it. Commander, the Navy owes you more than medals. It owes you justice. And tonight, it will get it. My jaw tightened. Not from anger, but from control. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity, accountability, recognition of the truth I carried alone for a decade. And tonight, that truth had a voice louder than theirs ever had. I lifted my chin and finally looked away from them, turning my attention back to the Admiral as protocol demanded. But not before I saw it. The moment they broke. For men who once laughed at my failure, now stared at me like they were witnessing the ruins of their own legacy. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of being seen. Afraid of being remembered. Afraid of standing in the shadow of a woman who had risen far beyond the reach of their lies. And for the first time in 10 years, I felt the shift of power. They had taken everything from me, but in front of an entire base. With the dust of my Apache still settling behind me, their undoing had finally begun. I didn't rush the space between us. I closed it bit by bit, letting each step remind them of who held the ground now. Their stances shifted unconsciously, not to look strong, but because their bodies remembered something their minds tried to forget. Predators straighten. Prey stiffens. I stopped in front of them, close enough to see the fear sitting behind their eyes like trapped animals. I wanted to see their eyes when I said it. Hayes, I began. My voice low, steady, absolute. You were the first. His throat bobbed. He didn't speak. You cornered me. You touched me without permission. And when I said no, you took it as a challenge to destroy me. I watched shame wash over his face like a fever breaking. Briggs, I turned to him. You didn't care if I lived or drowned, as long as you had an excuse to call it weakness. His jaw clenched hard enough to crack a tooth. Dalton, your loyalty was never to the uniform. It was to the loudest voice in the room. And you followed him like a coward. Dalton dropped his gaze. He had nothing left to hide behind. Then Thorne. Lieutenant Commander Thorne. The man who signed the falsified report with the detached calm of someone wiping dirt off his hands. You, I said, stepping slightly closer. You knew the truth from the beginning. You knew exactly what they did. And you let it happen because it was easier than doing the right thing. His breath hitched, barely audible. He tried to stand tall, but his shoulders betrayed him. Folding inward, shrinking under the weight of the truth finally spoken aloud. I let silence settle between us. Heavy, punishing, deliberate. Then I said the words that had lived in my bones for 10 years. You invited me here to disgrace me, just like you tried a decade ago. My voice didn't rise, didn't crack, didn't tremble. Quiet power is the deadliest kind. Hayes, I said no to you. And you tried to ruin me. I shifted my stance, letting them feel every inch of authority I'd earned. Thorne. Briggs. Dalton, you helped him. You signed the report. You built the lie. You tried to bury me. Their eyes flicked. Not at me, but at each other. Cowards searching for shelter in the faces of other cowards. You didn't break me, I continued. My voice felt carved from stone. You built me. The truth of that line hit them harder than any accusation. Because it wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was ownership. Everything you did. Every sabotage. Every lie. Every attempt to drown me. You forged the woman who stands here now. I lifted a hand and pointed behind me. Not with arrogance, but with precision. The Apache towered under the lights. Massive, powerful, a silhouette carved from war itself. You turned me into this. I let the words hang. Let them digest. Let them understand. And now, I let my gaze lock onto haze. The sky is my command. For a moment, the world went completely still. Not quiet. Still. The kind of stillness that follows a firing squad's final shot. Their faces told the whole story. Regret twisted into fear. Fear tangled with shame. Shame collapsing into silence. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them apologized. Not one of them could. Because there are crimes you can mend. And there are crimes you carry. This one belonged to them. Forever. So I did the one thing they never expected. I turned my back to them. Not because I dismissed them, but because they were no longer worth facing. I walked away. Boots steady. Breath calm. Heart unshaken. Behind me, I heard nothing. No footsteps. No excuses. No voices. Just four men standing alone. In the wreckage of their own making. I didn't need to humiliate them. The truth had already done it for me. I didn't stay close to them. I didn't need to. Distance is sometimes the sharpest blade. From across the hangar, I watched the truth finally do what I never had to. Break them. Hayes was the first to crack. He tried to stand tall. Tried to hold on to that arrogance he wore like armor. But his face was betraying him faster than his pride could keep up. His chest rose unevenly. His eyes glossed over. His hands trembled. And for the first time since the night behind the barracks, I watched him lose control. A man who once smirked while I drowned now struggled just to stand upright. He pressed both palms against the bar table, head hanging, breathing like someone had driven a fist into his ribs. He wasn't facing me. He wasn't facing the Admiral. He was facing himself. And losing. Briggs tried to hold composure longer than the others. Discipline was his religion. Image was his god. But even he had limits. I saw the exact second his breathing tightened. A shallow, panicked inhale followed by a sharp pivot. He muttered something under his breath and moved toward the restroom. Steps too quick. Shoulders too tight. He wasn't going in there to fix his uniform. He was going in there to keep his lungs from collapsing under the weight of truth. Behind that door, I knew there would be shaking hands gripping the edges of a sink. A man staring at his reflection and seeing a coward where he once saw a leader. No punishment I could give him would hit harder than that realization. Thorne, the one they all followed, didn't move. Not at first. He stood rooted to the ground. But his strength wasn't strength anymore. It was shock. It was disbelief. He removed his officer cap slowly. Fingers trembling on the brim. Eyes never leaving the floor. In all his years of service, his rank had protected him from accountability. Tonight, rank only made the fall sharper. He held that cap against his chest for a long moment. Breathing in and out like a man realizing the truth he helped bury had grown into something he could no longer contain. Then he closed his eyes. That was the moment Thorne finally understood. Lies don't die when you bury them. They die when the person you buried returns. Dalton avoided everything. The lights. The whispers. The truth. He walked toward the hangar exit with quick, uneven steps. Head down. Hands clenched at his sides. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Shame walks fast. Cowardice walks faster. He stopped only once right at the edge of the doorway. As if his body refused to leave without acknowledging something his mind couldn't face. But he never turned around. He just disappeared into the night. Swallowed by the same darkness he left me in a decade ago. I watched all of it in silence. Not with triumph. Not with vengeance. With clarity. They weren't afraid of me, I said quietly. I let the words settle in my chest. Heavy and clean at the same time. They were afraid of the truth. Because the truth is louder than accusations, sharper than revenge, more permanent than shame. They weren't breaking because I had returned. They were breaking because the lie they had lived comfortably inside for 10 years had finally run out of room. And now, with the entire base watching, their reputations, their bravado, their carefully constructed illusions fell apart like rotted wood under pressure. I stood there long enough to memorize the moment, not because I needed it, but because they did. They needed to feel the weight of that night all over again. Not through paperwork, not through rumors, but through consequence. Real, undeniable consequence. Then I turned away. The truth had done its job. The past had finished speaking. And their downfall was no longer my burden to carry. I didn't look back at them when I turned toward the Apache. I didn't need to. The truth had already done what I came here to do. The cool night air hit my face as I walked across the tarmac. Not refreshing, but liberating. Like stepping out of a cage I never agreed to be locked inside. I approached my aircraft, the metal beast that had carried me through more fire than any of those men could ever imagine. It sat there waiting for me. Engines cooling, rotors slowing. Like a war creature resting between battles. I placed one hand on its side. Not for balance. For acknowledgment. This machine had saved me more times than the institution that was supposed to protect me. And tonight, it would take me away from the last shadow tying me to my past. I climbed into the cockpit with the ease of a woman stepping into her own skin. Every latch, every buckle, every switch. My hands knew them like memory knows pain. The moment I settled into the seat, the world outside shifted. I powered up the systems. The screens glowed to life. The rotors began to spin again. Slow at first, then faster, cutting into the night with the sound of rising purpose. I could see them through the glass. Not just the 4 men, but everyone. Officers, cadets, veterans, civilians, all of them looking up. And for the first time since the day they dumped my future into a shallow grave, they weren't looking at a failure. They were staring at the woman they couldn't destroy. Thorne had removed his cap. Briggs looked like he couldn't breathe. Dalton hovered at the hangar's edge, unsure if he should stay or run. Hayes looked like he'd just realized what a decade of lies had cost him. I watched them for a moment. Not with anger. Not with pity. With closure. I didn't return for revenge. Revenge is small. Revenge is loud. Revenge is temporary. I returned to remind them. I never needed their approval. Only my wings. My co-pilot gave me a thumbs up from the right seat. Ready when you are, Commander. I inhaled slowly, deeply, grounding myself in the silence before the roar. Take us up. The Apache lifted. First a tremble, then a rise, then a full, undeniable ascent that pulled the earth away beneath me. Dust swirled violently across the tarmac. The hangar lights blurred. Uniforms rippled in the wind. From above, the people grew smaller. The lights dimmer. The past quieter. But the 4 men stayed clear in my vision. Even as I rose higher. They didn't raise a hand. They didn't call out. They didn't try to pretend. They stood in the shadow of my ascent. Witnesses to the storm they created and could never control. The engines roared around me. A sound I'd come to love more than any applause. The night sky opened. Broad and dark and endless. And I flew into it without hesitation. Because the sky never judged me. The sky never lied about me. The sky never tried to end me. It only ever demanded one thing. Rise. So I did. The base shrank beneath me. The hangar lights faded. The last edges of that chapter dissolved into nothing but memory. And as the Apache cut through the darkness, I felt something I hadn't felt in 10 years. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting. The peace of reclaiming. The peace of a woman who finally buried the lie that tried to bury her. Fade out on the Apache lifting into the night sky. Not escaping. Not fleeing. Ascending. Just like I was always meant to.